In this segment, I'll say a little bit about purchasing power parity, material that I did not fully cover in the regular lecture, and then we will do example 5. First, as a recap, the relative version of purchasing power parity says that actual changes in exchange rates are driven by actual differences in national inflation rates in a given time period. We also have what is called the ex-ante version of purchasing power parity, which stems from the relative version. This version says that expected changes in exchange rates are driven by expected differences in national inflation rates in a given time period. So notice that the key difference between the relative version and the ex-ante version is that the relative version deals with actual changes and the ex-ante version deals with expected changes. In terms of the formula, you will notice that both formulas or expressions are very similar. Here we say that the percentage change in spot rate is approximately equal to the difference in the real or the actual inflation numbers, whereas over here we are looking at a difference between the expected inflation numbers. This little e over here represents expected inflation numbers. Just to make this a little more tangible, say that you are dealing with a given period from time 0 to time 1. So this is the period. And we have an exchange rate at time 0 and an exchange rate at time 1. The relative version of the purchasing power parity explains this difference from S0 to S1 based on the actual inflation rate in this period for the foreign currency and the actual inflation rate in the domestic currency, again based on actual. Whereas the ex-ante version does the following. So if we are at time 0, then the ex-ante version is trying to predict the expected value of S1. So that is this expected value, or more specifically, it is predicting the expected change in the rate sitting at time 0. And that expected change is based on the expected inflation numbers in the foreign currency and the domestic currency. Next point. Based on empirical evidence, purchasing power parity appears to be a valid framework to assess long-run fair value in the FX markets, even though the path to purchasing power parity equilibrium is excruciatingly slow. In simple terms, purchasing power parity seems to hold in the long run, but not in the short run. And the final point for this slide is related to real exchange rate. Real exchange rate deals with the real buying power of your money. And here is the expression that you need to remember. You saw this at level 1. Q generally is the symbol for real exchange rate. So foreign currency over domestic currency, or this could be price currency over base currency, is equal to the spot exchange rate, again foreign over domestic. And then CPI in the domestic currency divided by CPI in the foreign currency. If we are dealing with price currency and base currency, then you can convert F to the price currency and D to the base currency. Moving now to example 5. So I want you to first read this. And here is what we have. We have Australia and Japan. We are told that the interest rate in Australia is equal to 5%. The interest rate in Japan is equal to 1%. We are also told that the Australian currency seems roughly overvalued by 10%. So overvalued by 10%. Here is the first question. All else equal, which of the following events would restore the Australian dollar to its PPP value. In order to make this more tangible, let's just assume that the current exchange rate, and we will take Australian dollar as the base currency. We can also see that in the convention used over here. Let's just say for simplicity that the current exchange rate is equal to 100. If we are saying that the Australian dollar is 10% overvalued, that means that the base currency, which is the Australian dollar, is overstated currently. So this number is 10% higher than what it should be. What it should be is based on purchasing power parity. So for equilibrium to return, this number will have to come down by 10%. If the number does come down by 10%, then we can say that we have equilibrium. Restore Australian dollar to its PPP value. That means that it comes to equilibrium as defined by purchasing power parity. So the best answer is C. Next, if both the Australian and the Japanese CPI price levels increase by 5%, all else equal, then what is the change in the real exchange rate? Here you quickly regurgitate the formula that we just discussed. So the real exchange rate, Japanese yen over Australian dollar, is equal to the spot exchange rate, Japanese over Australian, into the CPI of the base currency, which is Australia, CPI of the price currency, which is Japan. If both these numbers are changing by the same amount and all else equal, which essentially means that the spot rate is not changing, then the real exchange rate will also not change. So the best answer is A. Next, if real interest rates in Japan and Australia are equal, then under the international Fisher effect, the inflation rate differential between Japan and Australia will be closest to what? Remember, with the international Fisher effect, we say that the real interest rate is the same in both countries, and we say that the differential between interest rates and inflation rates is the same. From the previous slide, we know that the differential between the interest rates is 4% because we had 5% in Australia and 1% in Japan, which means that the differential associated with the inflation rates will also be 4%. The best answer therefore is B. I want to emphasize the point here that these are models. Just because the model says something doesn't mean that this always holds true in every country. But the way the question will be positioned, you will be said that given so and so model, what is the scenario? So your job as a level 2 candidate is to know each of the models and to know what the model says. Next point. According to the theory and empirical evidence regarding purchasing power parity, which of the following would not be true if PPP holds in the long run? Emphasize the not. An exchange rate's equilibrium path should be determined by the long-term trend in domestic relative to foreign price levels. This is what purchasing power parity says. So this is a true statement and therefore not the correct answer. Deviations from PPP might occur over short and medium-term periods, but fundamental forces should eventually work to push exchange rates towards their long-term PPP path. This is also a true statement and therefore not correct. High inflation countries would tend to see their currencies appreciate over time. This is clearly false. Generally speaking, PPP tells us that high inflation countries will have their currency lose value. So false, and since we are looking for a not, C is the best answer. Next, which of the following would best explain the failure of the absolute version of PPP to hold? Absolute version of PPP says that the same good should sell for the same amount after making the currency translation. So we know that in the real world that doesn't hold. Why does it not hold? Because countries have restrictions. If you think about the car market in India and the car market in Japan, you can't just move a car from Japan to India without paying any custom or duty or taxes. So clearly there will be an impact. There'll also be transportation costs and so on. So it is unreasonable to say that a car should be worth the same amount in both countries. So the best answer here is C.